The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. Haven't read a Philip K. Dick book since I attempted to read Valis in my, I guess it was mid-20s. Didn't care for it, and I haven't gone back to him since. I was pleasantly surprised after a period of being unpleasantly gratified in my prejudice that I had about Dick, having read Valis, of him kind of being a crazy guy at a bus stop. For the first 2/3 of it or so, I found it incoherent, all over the map. A lot to do with the I Ching and spirituality and art, aesthetics, a bunch of stuff that didn't seem related as I was reading it. And then towards the end of the book, it does synthesize into something that I think is coherent and meaningful. And I walked away from the reading experience considering this one of the more sophisticatedly crafted pieces of science fiction that I have read. It's an alternate history, as I think we all know, of World War II if the Axis powers won. It's a subversion of, I guess, the Red Dawn template of these kinds of alternate histories of we expect there to be some kind of upswell of American patriotic resistance to Japanese and Nazi occupation, and it is conspicuously and immediately absent from the book. The book opens with this American shopkeeper, I think it opens on him, who over the course of the story is revealed to be a racist, and him recalling the early days after the end of the war and his sense of indignation at rule by Japan and the softening of that attitude over the course of a few months of coming to see how efficiently they run society. The basic premise being that wartime America would have been potentially perfectly happy to live in a racially hierarchical society as long as it was run with a kind of technocratic efficiency. There were a few things that really impressed me. The first was the characters. The characters are not all perfectly well drawn, but the ones that are photorealistic. They feel like real people. They are wonderfully conceptualized and realized characters. I also praise Dick for being able to paint these Axis powers and the Axis characters with enough of a subtle touch to allow the human characters that occupy those power structures to remain human, not necessarily sympathetic, but to remain human with knowable motivations. These aren't cartoon characters. It's not Captain Planet, or Captain America, rather, Captain Planet. The juxtaposition of the Japanese against the Nazis is very interesting. The Japanese are not portrayed particularly sympathetically, but there is definitely a distinction with a difference. The I Ching conceit I found irritating until it kind of clicked what the point was, that history is as contingent as an individual human life, that a lot of this is just blind chance. There are certain scenes that I think are some of the best written that I can possibly remember. The scene of that shopkeeper having a confrontation with an art buyer and having a crisis of conscience and finding the bedrock of a kind of upright patriotism based in aesthetic values is really fascinating. That's one of the most interesting, compelling scenes that I've read in a science fiction book. It's not going to crack my top 15, I don't think, but I gave it an 8 out of 10. I really admire it. It really, it made me much more interested in reading more Philip K. Dick. The books that I've attempted, he just seemed to get lost in the weeds a bit, but also I'm more used to the new wave style now than I was before, certainly. So yeah, more Philip K. Dick reviews to come. I have never been more excited or trepidatious about reviewing a book as this next one, Star of the Unborn by Franz Werfel. This is a completely forgotten science fiction novel that was published in 1946 that was Werfel's final book. He wrote it, finished it, I think I read somewhere just days before he passed away. I think that this is a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece with a couple of asterisks. It has flaws. It's been critically panned. It was critically panned at the time of its publication, interestingly. Most of the material that you can find online that isn't reader reviews on Amazon and Goodreads are literary reviews from the 40s when it was published that all kind of lambasted it as not being a serious book or not of real literary interest. And I wonder if that was because of the time in which it was published. It was published right after the close of World War II, when the atmosphere may not have been all of that sympathetic to something like a big science fiction fantasy spectacle. Star of the Unborn opens with an acknowledgement of this, of Werfel thinking out loud to himself and to the reader about how he feels some level of responsibility or pressure from the reading public to discuss the horrors of the world and to dwell in the blood and guts and sorrow of the war, and chooses consciously not to, and to embark on this very strange, phantasmagorical odyssey of a book that deals with it obliquely and allegorically, but not directly. That is not necessarily a comment upon the war, a book in which the war lingers always at the peripheries and in the background, and is occasionally foregrounded explicitly. There is an allusion to the Holocaust towards the end of the story that's pretty conspicuous, but it's a strange mix. It's a strange mix of being a really heavy and serious contemplation of things to do with the war, of big philosophical ideas, and also this whimsical, strange, fabulous exercise in world building for the sake of world building. Werfel was an Austrian Jew who is most famous for being a poet and for writing The 40 Days of Musa Dog, I think is how it's pronounced, which is a novel about the Armenian genocide, which was really influential in bringing the Armenian genocide to light in public awareness when it was published. That book got him on the Nazis' bad side. They burned his books. They waged a PR campaign against him, and he was forced to flee first to France and then to Los Angeles when the war did break out. He was also a veteran of World War I. Werfel was friendly with a lot of really famous names, people like Franz Kafka, Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, but never achieved their level of recognition or fame. Star of the Unborn, as far as I can tell from my research, is his only work of speculative fiction. Although Werfel was Jewish, he had a lifelong sympathy towards Catholicism, and Star of the Unborn, in large part, is a reflection upon those sympathies. The protagonist is Franz Werfel himself, who is resurrected in a far, far, far future where society has kind of reached this level of perfect material abundance, political homeostasis. Everybody, it's kind of like the Time Machine. It's like the Eloi in the Time Machine. But people are still sapient. People have achieved this high, high, high degree of culture and scientific achievement. And all of the rough edges appear to have been smoothed over. But we learn as the book goes on that there are outliers to this system. The surface of the Earth is almost completely uniformly flat and covered in a gray astroturf that facilitates psychic communication between the occupants of the astromental world, as they call it. The astromental citizens live underground. They have tunneled downwards. Werfel is a kind of embodied corporeal ghost. He's summoned into being by an old friend of his who's only named by his initials, who has undergone many cycles of death and rebirth and has been reborn organically into the astromental world, but maintains his memory of his past lives, so chooses to resurrect Werfel as an offering to a newlywed couple for their wedding party. Werfel's introduction into this system becomes destabilizing and something of note, and he is called upon to pass big moral, philosophical judgments upon the operations of society, and becomes politically key in a very slowly unfolding conflict. I noticed and I cannot possibly have been the first to notice this, although I can't find anybody else talking about this online, that Past Master by R.A. Lafferty bears such a close resemblance to this plot that it borders on homage, and I wonder if it was. Star of the Unborn, if you have read Past Master, is like a much slower, softer rendition of kind of the same plot with the same essential philosophical outlook and political character. I was overwhelmed with a sense of specialness of having found something that was really, really important and really tragic for having been left behind by history. And it's giving me goosebumps to be able to reintroduce it back into the culture a little bit, or maybe put it on people's radar, because I think it is a work of literature with a capital L. At times it is really exasperating to read because he goes on these long tangents, these flights of fancy, of philosophizing out loud, and it's slow. It takes forever for the actual plot to kick in and for there to be any kind of friction in the story other than his kind of internal philosophical misgivings. But Werfel writes with an absolutely beautiful and interesting, unique, strange narrative voice where he interjects personal reflections and anecdotes into the story. And you never get the impression that he was writing from a blueprint or any kind of a plan or template. He kind of follows his thoughts along where they lead him. And they lead him into these flourishes of amazing world building. It's a book that I think is going to be with me forever, not because it says anything that is all that unusual. He reaches philosophical conclusions that are pretty familiar, especially having read Past Master. It's, like I said, kind of the same book, but there are bits of world building. There are certain scenes, certain characters that will linger and linger and linger, and Werfel himself will linger. There's something about the way that he writes that is both erudite and very vulnerable, very personable, at times comical, at times somnolent and self-involved. Very few books I've read where the author has such an immediate, tangible presence, and to have that be a really positive thing. It is a rare book. It's hard to find. There's a few copies online that you may be able to find for like $20 or so if you get lucky enough to run into it in the wild. I would pick it up. Don't expect a big blockbuster. If you like sprawling epics, if you like philosophical science fiction, or if something that I've described just sounds interesting, I recommend that you find it and read it. I think it's worth the investment of time and the investment of maybe a little bit more money than you're used to spending on a used book. I consider it by far a greater literary accomplishment than anything else that I've read from this period. And I haven't read so much. There may be a big trump card waiting in the wings from the 40s that I'm not aware of, that hasn't crossed my path, but I think this stands heads and shoulders over something like Tolkien, which was Tolkien was written. Lord of the Rings was written like a decade after this, and I think this is a completely superior work of literature. I can't think of anything that I prefer from that period. Next, I read Dreamsnake by Vonda McIntyre. This was another random pick. These were all random picks after the first one, and I kind of cleaved to the random pick in honor of the I Ching theme. Dreamsnake I had high expectations of because it gets talked up a lot. It's a really famous book, considered science fantasy. Science fantasy for its structure more than the actual content, which essentially has nothing to do with fantasy at all. It's just structured like a fantasy adventure story, like a sword and sorcery story maybe. And it works. I didn't love it. I thought it felt like YA that had a lot of fairly explicit, at times graphic content in it. I don't mean YA to sound all that pejorative, but it just had this quality that it just felt like a formal presentation to me. The prose style I didn't connect with. I thought it was a little dry, a little styleless. It does all hang together. It works. There are parts of it that I think are really cool. Other parts I was quite underwhelmed by. The villain, I think, is pretty bad. The action kind of zigzags. Not all the characters are great. And like I said, the writing itself isn't all that impressive, but it is an interesting property. It has a Dying Earth feel to it. It's a mixture of the archaic and the futuristic. There are little bits of high technology that are still available to humans, but for the most part, they live in like this medieval kind of a world. And the main character is named Snake, and she's kind of a Bedouin. She's this wandering doctor who uses snakes, genetically modified snakes, to administer medicine. It is a fairly heavy book. It deals with issues of child abuse and drug addiction. It's a competent book. I didn't dislike it, but it just didn't quite hit the button for me, as it were. Will-O-The-Wisp by Thomas Burnett Swann is an obscure fantasy book that's marketed here on the cover as a science fantasy. It really is not. It's an alternate history and a fantasy and a romance. It's a fictionalized retelling of the life of Robert Herrick, who was a real figure who lived in the English countryside in, I think it was Devon, in the 1620s, 1630s, or at least that's when the action of the novel takes place. And he's a country vicar who is suspected of having pagan sympathies and having cultivated a relationship with an enclave of witches who live in the bogs. The story follows a teenage boy who kind of falls in love with Herrick platonically, who's charged with going to live with Herrick and spying on him on behalf of his father, and asked to report him for any kind of seditious pagan activities or sympathies. Eventually, they do go fraternize with the pagans in the bog, and strange things are revealed. I would not call this a masterpiece. It is certainly one of the best fantasy books that I've read. It's one of, I think, 2 romances that I've ever finished, so it's my favorite romance novel. It's a critique of Puritanism. It has a strong erotic through line. It's a bawdy, lustful tale. Lots of heaving bosoms at maypole dances and etc. Lots of trysts in the forest. Swann was a poet first, to my understanding, and a novelist second. This is one of his later novels. It was certainly good and certainly unusual. It made me curious to read more Swann. I think his most famous book is Weirwoods. And I've seen that a couple times. It has really weird, bad covers. But next time I see that, I will pick it up. Finally, Burning Chrome by William Gibson. Neuromancer, one of my favorite novels ever. And this, of course, is a direct corollary with Neuromancer. These short stories precede Neuromancer. A bunch of them are set in the Sprawl universe. They are not all Sprawl stories, which was good because actually while I loved the Sprawl stories, my favorite was not a Sprawl story. My favorite was Hinterlands, which is one of the finest pieces of cosmic horror or science fiction horror that I've ever read. It's like an entire Peter Watts novel condensed down into just a handful of pages. It kicks ass. I mean, all of these stories kick ass. William Gibson kicks ass. There is a reason why he became so famous and so imitated. There is just something about him, the way that he writes, the themes that he works with. It's just a perfect marriage. He is a prose master. His facility with language and his ability to kind of write everything under this unifying umbrella of a certain aesthetic, a certain kind of moral sensibility and outlook on the world, an outlook on technology and corporate power that makes everything feel like it does exist in the same universe, even if maybe it doesn't. I still think Neuromancer is the better book. That's not a terribly controversial opinion, I don't think. We'll see. As you can tell, I was pretty geeked on it. There were a couple bits that dragged. I think that has more to do with me than with the stories, though. Gibson, you have to really focus on him. It takes a lot of attention to key in on what's going on in these stories. There's a lot that is between the lines, and they are dense with terminology, and they're stylistically a little bit strange, a lot bit strange at times, and I found myself kind of stalling out from time to time. And it's more to do with the fact, like I said, that I just have had quite a bit on my mind lately. You know, everything's fine, but I've just had a cluttered brain, and there were a few times where I realized I'd just been scanning the same 3 paragraphs for like half an hour. It's worthy of dedicating a lot of focus and concentration on, and sometimes if you're not able to do that, it just ceases to make sense. Like New Rose Hotel, one of the most well-known stories in Burning Chrome. I have no idea what happened in that. I need to go back and reread it. My favorites were Hinterlands and the Gernsback Continuum, and maybe the title story, Burning Chrome. Surprise, surprise, it completely rocks. Okay, we're gonna do a random pick live, which we haven't done in a while. Okay, here we go. Capricorn Games, what the hell is that? Oh, that's Silverberg, isn't it? It is. Cool, I'm not complaining. We'll never complain about reading Silverberg. This is, I think, an obscure one. Is there a term for this kind of a paperback? Because I find these occasionally, I don't know if I like them or not. The kind of laminated, textless back paperback. I have read more Silverberg books than any other science fiction author. I think probably any other author at this point. So we'll get one more. I'm going to keep going with a random pick. It's serving me well. So I'll see you on the next Fiverr.